Good evening. Good evening. On behalf of Explore the Arts, I'd like to welcome you to the Kennedy Center tonight. My name is Renata Danks, and I work for Explore the Arts, which is a program of the Kennedy Center's Education Division. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a conversation with Philip Glass. This conversation will be between Mr. Glass and WNO Artistic Director Francesca Zambello. Before we begin, I'd like to make you aware of a few events coming up in conjunction with Mr. Glass here at the center. We have the making of Appomattox, which is this Sunday, November 8th at 5 p.m. It will be a conversation in our terrace gallery with the creative team of Appomattox, and the attendees will be invited to attend the evening's Sitzprobe in the Opera House. We also have WNO's Appomattox running from November 14th to the 22nd. At this time, I'd like to introduce WNO Artistic Director Francesca Zambello and Philip Glass. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Good evening. Thank you. Hi. Hi. Thank you. Good evening. Hi. Okay. Those are brochures, and I'm going to start handing them out right now, so I just have pick them up. We'll give them out afterwards. They're just, little reminders. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Very glad you're here for this discussion about our, I guess we're calling it a revised world premiere, but I basically think it's almost all new. But let's get into that. Hang on one second, because I don't know if everybody knows who you are, but do they really know who you are? That's an important question. First of all, Philip is a native of this area. He was born in Baltimore. Yay, Baltimore.
Went to the Peabody.
Went to Peabody, went to Aspen, went to Juilliard, went to University of Chicago, and then, of course, went famously to Paris, where he studied with Nadia Boulanger, who was in many ways the mother to many important composers, including Aaron Copland and Virgil Thompson. And then, as you know, if you've read his bio, began a long collaboration with Ravi Shankar, came back to New York in 1967, and began what is known as the Philip Glass Ensemble with 7 musicians, which still exists. Amazing to me that this composer has never had an opera at the Kennedy Center. He has written over 25 operas, has written the scores for 30-some-odd films, has written symphonies, concertos, piano works, just about everything. I know very few composers who have your diversity today, short of Bach, or a few other people who,
They
nobody...
must have been teaching school somewhere.
They probably. And few people who have written as epic works as things like Einstein on the Beach or Civil Wars, but who have also written compact one-act operas, which have forwarded, I think, the art form. I'm not going to use the M word, minimalist, but we can talk about repetitive patterns and that sort of thing as we go on. So, Philip, I am thrilled finally to have an opera at the Kennedy Center. Why did it take so long?
Well, when did you start working here?
Just a couple years ago.
Well, I guess that was when I began. We began talking about this. But we go back a long way. Francesca was you did the premiere of Orphée, which is actually a very, for the opera's one, it's a very popular one.
It's a very popular one. It's based on the Cocteau film, and we did it, I hate to say, more than 20 years ago at the American Repertory Theater. But
that's right.
But
and we've been working. Didn't we do a play?
Yes, we've had our 20-some-odd years together off and on.
I was one of the producers of your work.
Yes, that's true as well.
Yeah.
That's true as well.
Was,
But now I'm proud to be the producer of this work here,
Yeah,
and I also want to welcome, in case you don't know, the director of Appomattox, who is here this evening, Taswell Thompson. I think he's here. Where is he? He's right there. Taz, just. So actually, when I got hired here, one of the things that I wanted to do here was Appomattox. I heard it in San Francisco Opera where it had its world premiere. And when I heard it, I thought, well, this work isn't fully cooked yet. And like many composers, people need more than one go-around. So I met quite soon in my tenure here with Philip and Christopher Hampton, who is the librettist, who's a playwright who I had worked with before as well, and asked them to re-envisage the work, which you have done quite nobly with Christopher and with Tazwell. And I'd love it if you would just, first of all, talk about what the opera is.
Well, first of all, we have to talk a little bit about what Christopher did too, because before we had done the opera in 2005, and it began. It was just called Appomattox, and it was really about the first act, or most of the first act was about the fall of Richmond. It was a really historical piece, and then we got a little bit into the civil rights stuff afterwards, because my feeling has always been that a big American story is the Civil Wars. That's partly growing up in Baltimore. We were all bused at Gettysburg several times. I mean, this is, we call this a border state, or whatever you want to call it, but it was all the, many of the issues of the South were alive and well in Baltimore, so that was where I grew up. So the Civil Wars was something we knew about in a very immediate way. It was the history that we knew. And I really have always thought it was a great American story, because the tremendous energy that came out of an immigrant population and an enslaved population that became an immigrant population. But there are people who are native to North America, but we don't. I think some of them are even in Congress at this point. But really, one of the most amazing things about America is how global it is, and how much thrives here, and this whole story of the Civil Wars for me became in the end about the intermingling of peoples in a way. Now that's a very kind way of talking about it. Now we can talk about it in the other way, in terms of a country that was plagued with racism and all kinds of very negative factors as well, but also very positive things.
Right, but so when you did the first version, you really focused on the Civil War and the end of the Civil War at Appomattox.
No.
And you touched on things 100 years later.
Now, the person who really helped us was Christopher, because I did not want to get an American writer. I didn't think that any American writer could come to the subject without so much baggage that it would just overload the piece. And I asked Christopher Hampton, who's a Brit, and I had done some work with him before, and a number of pieces, and I asked him if he would be interested, and he said, well, I don't know anything about the Civil Wars. Then he called me 3 months later and said, I know everything about it now. And he wrote a beautiful libretto. Now, when we got finished with it, we got, just as I said, up to the murder of the 3 civil rights workers that happened in 65. And then he is a playwright and writes movies also, but is very well known in the theater. And he was invited to do a piece for
the Guthrie Theater.
And he got the idea of bringing in some more characters. Now that wasn't my idea, and I don't know if you thought about it, but I went to see it, and suddenly there was LBJ and Martin Luther King and George Wallace and J. Edgar Hoover, and I thought that was amazing. But what happened after that in the years that followed, because that was done in 2007, I think that that happened in 2011. So that's 4 years. But what happened, and that we talked about this, that you and I talked about this, was that some of the signature achievements of LBJ were being undone by our own Supreme Court. Now, the great thing about being in America is I can talk about the Supreme Court here, and I won't go to jail. Yeah,
That's right.
And there are a lot of
I
places
think we should just clarify for everybody when we talk about the Supreme Court and some of Johnson's acts is that the second act of the opera now focuses on 100 years after the end of the Civil War. It goes from 1865 in the first act and the so-called treaty or resolution between Generals Grant and Lee. And then the second act goes forward 100 years to 1965 and begins really with an incredibly stirring moment, which is where we see Martin Luther King. And we begin really with Selma. And to me, what's so amazing is that the victory of the second act, if you can call it a victory, is the Voting Rights Act. And the conflict and then the resolution between LBJ and MLK, in a way, is the core of the second act. So you're trying to pick up the pieces from Act One that really aren't resolved and try to resolve them in some way in the second
and in
act.
fact, we still haven't resolved them.
Well, is there an epigraph with
there's
Ferguson?
An epilogue, which Christopher says we should call that 2015, in which one of the murderers of no, the person who actually killed Martin Luther King was that Fowler?
Yes.
The
trooper.
Trooper, and he made, now this I asked at one point. I was so astonished by what Christopher wrote. I was calling him and saying, "Did this really happen?" He said it, and he said, "I didn't make up anything," but he did make up one little scene, the scene where Fowler, the trooper Fowler, meets the murderer of the 3 civil rights workers, and they have a talk about it. It is so scary. It comes up at the end of the second act.
Right. So he meets a character called.
What's that?
He meets a character called, who you've invented.
No, Fowler. We didn't invent him.
No, but you invented this meeting.
We invented the meeting, but Fowler actually was arrested in 2011. 40
and brought to trial.
Brought to trial, and he was. I think they gave him 4 months in jail. I mean, on the other hand, Killen, the guy who was
3 months, but yeah.
Was it 3 months?
Mm-hmm.
Killen, what is in for? I think he said at one point in the discussion, he says he had 40 more years to serve. But anyway, what happens? It's a very curious thing about when I looked at the first and second act. When we got through it, and we started talking about all kinds of things about how we'd stage it. By that time, I was talking with our director,
Taswell,
and and we were talking, and I looked at the first act, and you had these very, I would say, by comparatively elegant men, like.
Frederick Douglass appears in the first act. Lincoln appears in the first act. Grant and Lee appear in the first act.
And they speak in prose. And how they were. Many of them. Abraham Lincoln is also in that act. So you have these men who were self-educated mostly, and the beginning of it and the kinds of things they talk about. Even the discussions of the surrender between the two men it's an amazing, and by the way, those conversations were recorded, and we were able to get that was available to us. Mm-hmm. So in Appomattox, there were people writing down every word that was said, so we had all that stuff.
That scene is incredibly civilized.
What?
I think the meeting of the generals is an incredibly civilized scene.
Now then you get into Act Two, and suddenly you got LBJ.
Right.
Who was, In fact,
Not to say he wasn't civilized, but
well, he was a guy from Texas, and he was a very he was a rude person in his language, but a very powerful one. Probably one of the interesting thing. Can I just say one of the things that happens? Act One begins with Frederick Douglass meeting Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln says to him at the White House, and he says, "And what can I do for you in my second term?" And he says, "Suffrage. We need suffrage." Act Two begins with Martin Luther King meeting LBJ in the Oval Office, and he says the same. And this really happened. He said, "What can I do for you?" He said, "We need the vote." And there's another little part to that, which it didn't get in the opera because other things did not get in the opera that could have gotten in the opera. But at one point, he said the vote for all. I think he said the word qualified colored men or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then he said someone raised the issue of, well, what about women's vote? And Abraham said, well, wait a second. You're going too fast for me.
that took quite a while later.
It took quite a while for that to happen. But the idea, the thing about LBJ, which I didn't really, in my generation, we thought of him as the man that got stuck in Vietnam. So he was not a popular person.
No, but history has been kind to him.
But in retrospect, he was one of the most significant and powerful presidents we ever had.
Right. So now how do you, as a composer, give voice to Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass?
Well,
I mean, the American history laid out before. What do these people sound like?
Okay, now we get into what opera's about.
I think so.
Because I can write the music,
Right.
Richard will write the words, but we can't get on stage and sing it. And we can't do it ourselves.
No, but how do you think, okay,
No,
Martin Luther King is a bass. What kind of bass?
We have to talk about the singing ensemble that we have.
Let's talk about it.
They have embraced this piece, and Tazol has been working with them. And without a company that was as committed, they are bringing this to life in a way which, I'm just writing it.
Yeah, but I actually think that the music that you wrote, if I may say, to me, is incredibly, don't freak out, romantic.
Well,
I think that it
parts of it are, yes.
It sounds very different than some of your music that I think we have heard.
even Orfeo? You did Orfeo.
Yeah, well, Orfeo had romantic, Death was romantic. But I find that some of these incredibly stirring monologues, particularly of Martin Luther King, are like a fusion of what I consider your language, but with a kind of American, modern, romantic feeling.
Well,
huge sweeping lyric lines, huge legato writing.
In fact, the trajectory from the opening scene with Julia Grant, she begins singing. The opera begins with a scene with women and ends with a scene with women, because I decided we weren't going to rob women of the glory of the.
No, and that is the right. It begins with Julia Grant, obviously the wife of General Grant, talking about the spring and how the spring brings another campaign, because of course the Civil War, like any war up until World War I, was a seasonal thing. You took the winter off, and then you went back out in the spring. And so you hear from the women so movingly in what begins as an aria and develops into a quintet. Again, something that I don't normally find in your writing, this sort of big ensemble writing.
I would say that.
You write big choruses. You don't write like quartets and quintets.
My idea was to begin and end with women. Mm-hmm. Christopher embraced that idea, and that's how we did it. But I really wanted to say that the thing about opera is that it does take performers. It does take singers. It takes commitment. It takes a director who can envision the whole thing and can actually round up the energy and round up the commitment of the very talented people that we have.
Yeah, but I will tell you, Philip, as a director, without good material, you're nothing. You're nothing.
That's right.
We've all had to make something out of like a score where you go, oh my God, this is a mess. What am I going to do? But there's nothing to apologize about in this score. It is full of heroic characters, but also extremely human moments. Yeah. That's the thing, is to portray people who are heroes, but make them feel real. And I think that's what this score achieves.
A lot of the words were spoken by them. Christopher was very, and I said to him, some of these things, I said, where did you find this? And he said, I didn't make up anything. He said, there were transcripts, there were phone conversations, there were written accounts. John Lewis, as a young man, appears in the opera. Mm-hmm. We've invited him to come. Do you know if it's coming?
We've invited him to come, plus we've invited various members of Viola Liuzzo, who's considered one of the Selma martyrs, who was a white woman who was transporting several African-American men after the march, who was murdered. And then the FBI tried to make it look like she was a loose woman sleeping with these men. She left behind 5 children, and so we have invited her daughters.
Really?
Yes, and I'm hoping that one of them is going to come.
They're coming from Detroit?
Yes. One of the daughters doesn't live in Detroit. She lives in Pennsylvania, and so I have written to her and invited her. And of course, we have invited LBJ's family is still around.
Oh my gosh. Well, the language of the opera is the language that we used, and it's.
But I think I hear what you're saying about Christopher, and he's done a masterful libretto, because history is always hard to put on the stage, because history is fascinating, but it's not always theatrical. And I think what he has done has managed to make us feel like we don't know the outcome. We don't know what's going to happen.
Well,
by personalizing so much of it.
Well, in fact, when we got to this new second act, mm-hmm. I had the feeling that I was chasing history rather mm-hmm. than writing. In fact, only about 6 weeks ago, Amelia Boynton died, and we read about her in the New York Times, and that she was one of the organizers of the original march.
Right.
And I said, well, she has to be in the opera.
And she is. We've given one of the characters her name now. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we brought her in. But I also have the feeling, though, this isn't the thing that, in terms of my own work, and I don't even talk about what other people have done. I've done historical pieces before, but this is one where history was changing in front of me, where we were struggling to catch up with events.
Right.
The opera very much becomes about the voting rights, and it comes up first through the eyes of LBJ, of Lyndon Johnson, and it becomes when you say I'm not even sure that the opera's over yet. I mean,
Act 3, I'm sure we could come up with. I mean,
in 5 or 6 years, we may find that there are things that need to be included. And if that happens, then the opera becomes kind of more like a journal of maybe a kind of a high state of journalism.
Well, do you think? I mean, you have written a lot of very historical characters. You have had presidents in other operas.
I've had Abraham Lincoln in 3 operas.
Right. Okay.
And I've had Martin
Gandhi.
Luther King in 2. Yes, I've had him in 2. He's in the Gandhi opera.
Yes. Satyagraha.
I actually call this my Mount Rushmore opera, because there are more presidents in this one than the other ones. And it's funny. Why would I never thought I was that interested in American history, but in point of fact, the people are almost they're historical people. They're people we know. We know who they are. We've admired them. Some of them we've despised and learned. But even for some of our singers, Taswell has told me that it has been a challenge for them to sing some of the words that some of the people sing, because they're not all. This is not an opera made out of angels. These are angels and devils. And there's one person who when you come, and I think after tonight, I hope you all will come. If you weren't thinking of
not just coming, all come, all bring 20
we
friends.
We got to do 100% here, right?
Okay.
Yeah. But for him to say the words of the murderer, and the commitment and the way that our company has embraced this work, it has been, it's an emotionally wrenching experience.
Let's hope
Is that
so
right,
for everyone.
Taz?
Taz?
Taz, is that right? Yes. Okay, he isn't saying. But maybe
do you think that opera can be and should be something that makes social change?
Oh, well,
I mean, this
yeah,
is clearly an example of that.
The first opera I did really was Satyagraha. And the idea of Satyagraha was to do an opera which talked about social change and nonviolence in one opera, and that was Gandhi.
Is that your most produced grand opera?
You know, I'm not sure anymore.
I feel like it is. I mean, I've seen it many times.
Yeah, the Met made a video of it and that kind of thing, but I'm not sure. I really don't know anymore. I don't know. In any year, there could be 8 or 10 operas being done. Really?
Right, but I mean in the big pieces, you know, Civil Wars, Einstein on the Beach, the Voyage.
Akhenaten is coming in into the English National Opera, and they're doing it in Los Angeles. I don't really know anymore, but certainly thematically, political topics, or say social topics. Mm-hmm. Social topics and political topics aren't exactly the same, but things about social change and about society that has become an important part of the work. The first one was Satyagraha, mm-hmm. Though in retrospect, I elevated Einstein into that as well.
Right.
Right. But that was in retrospect. And then I put in Akhenaten to kind of finish off that first trilogy. Mm-hmm. That was the 18th dynasty Egyptian pharaoh who is considered to be the first person to embrace monotheism in a cultural way. So one important part, I think, as I grew myself and as I raised children and got involved with society and as I became more mature about the world that I lived in, I found that I was doing more and more things that had a social-political side to it. Even something like Kepler.
Right.
It's like Kepler was one of the great. He was a contemporary of Galileo. He was a little bit younger, but the same period. And he talks about Europe the way we talk about Europe today. He talks about blood running in the streets. He mm-hmm. talks about, and you say, my God, has nothing changed?
Right.
Has nothing gotten better? But partly when you find people, enormous personalities like that, who speak to us today, the fact that they resonate so much with us, it's humbling. And it's also, I think we are forced to think of ourselves in a different perspective then. Not as the edge of modernity, not as the latest thing right. that's happening, but right. as just another society that is going to come and go and will have left its mark. I don't think anyone thinks that there's been a greater playwright than Shakespeare. Though we may try.
How come you've never said any of his works?
I'm afraid to. But I thought of it.
Okay. Now, I'd love to talk a little about you just from the composer side, because that's something that I think many of our audience would like to know more about. I'd love to know more about your actual process. Like, do you still write at the piano? Because he's a fantastic pianist if you've never heard him perform.
Well,
because most composers now, younger composers now, they don't write at the piano.
No,
they write at the computer. A lot of them can't even play an instrument.
Use music paper. In fact, I have to get my music paper printed by a printer now. I can't buy it anymore. It turns out not to be even much more expensive than buying it. I use still pencil and paper, so I'm writing with pencil and paper. The piano is very useful, but an opera like this, you really can't play it on the piano.
Right.
You just don't have.
But do you write? Is it just come out? You pour it onto the page?
Mostly, as I've gotten older, I've liked the piano. Mm-hmm. But when I was younger, I didn't use it that much. I use it more now than before. And I think that's partly because I've also become attached to the actual physical sound of music. When I began, it was maybe more a cerebral attachment, but as I got older, it became more about the quality of music itself. So I do find myself playing the piano more. I'm playing the piano and doing concerts all the time now.
Right. Can you talk about your ensemble a little? Because
Well, the ensemble
there's so
began-
many sides of you.
Yeah, that was, I began that in maybe 1968 or 69, and I had come back from studying with Boulanger, and I decided I didn't want to be a music teacher, but I was going to try to make a living playing music.
Tell everybody, don't tell me, tell them,
What?
tell the
Oh,
audience.
So
Okay.
I got together with some friends who, other composers, it was easy to find, who would, because they didn't have any work either, and I put together an ensemble, and we began playing, and that group has been, even today now, everyone in the ensemble is a composer. And
Who is in the ensemble now?
well, Michael Reisman has been there for a long time. John Gibson is another composer.
Tell them, tell them.
John
tell them.
Gibson, okay, sorry. Lisa Bialava and Eleanor Sandrusky, so we have two women composers.
Right.
Actually, we have, there could be more. But the ensemble in its heyday, which is actually probably we're still in the heyday in a way, we don't do that many concerts a year. We do 40 or 50 concerts a year. Now the Cronus does 100.
That is I know, but you have a full-time composing career. Tonight alone, your works are being performed in 4 cities.
That may be true.
No, that's a good thing.
Well, I just came from Los Angeles where we did a score to Dracula, the movie. We just did 4 shows of 4 performances. And
Thank God, no singers.
no.
Now, what about movies? Because you have written so many scores, most notably The Hours,
Yeah,
which is
and the Kundun by Marty Scorsese, and I did a Woody Allen movie too, but not one of his hits.
But what about what about writing for film? I mean, there's the whole there's a procedure, and do you do that? Normally they get a rough cut, and then they're working off of that.
There is let's say an industry format of how you do
Right.
it, where you do the movie first, and the music comes at the end. And I've done plenty of that, but I've also done work with filmmakers where the music came at the same time as the image. In fact, when I was doing a film with Godfrey Reggio, he did a film you may know called Cogne Scazzi, and I went to do the second movie with him. We went to the gold. Thank you. We went to the gold mines of the Cerro Pelado gold mines in Brazil, and I had this idea. I had seen pictures of this place through Cousteau had done a short documentary about it, and I wrote music for the gold mine, and I recorded it, and I went down there with Godfrey, and I played it for the people in the mines, and I played it, and the guy who was filming listened to the music while he was filming. It was really so. I
That's
began
atypical.
What?
That's very atypical.
Well, it's not atypical, but it is. No one does
No, but
that.
I mean, nobody does. I mean, normally, just so you know, there's a rough cut. A director does a rough cut, and then the composer basically is sitting there often working with a time code,
That's right.
really composing exactly to
I've done a lot of that,
to what's on the screen in front of them.
No, with Scorsese, I convinced him to let me write music while he was shooting. And he was shooting this movie about the Dalai Lama. And he was shooting it in Morocco because he couldn't shoot in Tibet. And I did the first 4, in those days we talked about movie in 6 reels, like 6 chapters. And I wrote, I talked him into first of all hiring me, and then second of all letting me write the music first. And he didn't get it at all at first. And I said, because we had agreed on I would be the composer. I said, okay, now we have to talk about the movie. And he said, no. In about 4 months we'll talk about it because I have to shoot it first. I said, no, Marty, we're going to do it now. He said,
Tell them.
He said, no, what do you mean? I said, well, I want to start the music. I want to write the music while you're shooting, and I'm going to send you music to listen to. I want the actors to hear it while they're performing. And he went, this is what he went like this for a long time, and finally said, okay. And I did it. And by the time we got to the sixth reel, he got to the sixth reel, and I had only done 5 reels, and I was in Europe doing some concerts. I got a hold of me, he said, look, I have to have the music for the 6th reel. Where's the music? And I said, well, I'm on tour right now. I said, this is Scorsese. I've got to have that music. I have to have it by Monday. You know, it was like Thursday. And I had the weekend off. I flew home. I wrote the reel. And I said, this isn't really the music, but you can use this for right now. It turned out to be really the music. Because I've been able to do it with a handful of, most filmmakers will not do that. But the fact that Marty did it impressed me. I did it a little bit with, what I found out, the more experienced and more secure people in their art, like Scorsese, and that would be true for Woody Allen too, the more experienced they were, the more willing they were to do an experiment like that. But the younger they were, and the more insecure they were, the more they felt they had to boss me around. And isn't that life? Isn't that the way
What was Woody Allen like?
Oh, I love working with him. He was very, very funny.
Well, one would hope so.
Well, but one thing I found out about him, that when I had never met him before, but I met him to look at the movie, and I noticed that all those funny things that he does in the movies, he does it in real life, but in a miniature way. You see him, you see all the gestures, but we see what he did. He took himself and blew himself larger than life, put himself in the movies, but that is him, but it's not him. Mm-hmm. He turns out to be he was a very serious filmmaker, very smart guy. And with him, we looked at this movie and he said, okay, now what do we do? Because he doesn't use composers. He usually, what we call it needle dropping, he puts records on. And I said, well, now we're going to spot the movie. And he said, well, what's that? And I said, well, you have to tell me where the music goes. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, just put the music in. I said, well, where does it go? He said, well, put the music in where it goes. I love this guy. I mean, so basically, of the 20 or so cues I wrote for him, only one was in the wrong place. And one, he said, shouldn't have been there at all. And I said, Marty, I'll just write you another if you don't like it. He said, no, there's no music there. And then in another place, there was another scene, and he said, I played it, because he said, what else can I do? I said, well, when I write the cues, I want you to come and listen to it. I'm not going to give it to your music editor or your film editor. You've got to hear it, because I want to see what you think of it. And so he agreed to that, though he broke the agreement after, because he went on tour with his band at a certain point. I didn't see him for a while. But with that, he basically he let me kind of do what I wanted. What I loved about Marty, he let me do what I wanted to do. He didn't tell me anything. And then one day he said, I wrote some music. He said, oh, is there music there? And I said, oh yes, there is. He said, okay.
But you have worked, I mean, I will tell you, I've worked with many living composers, and some of them are impossible, basically. You have worked, he's one of the easiest people to work with, but you have worked with every living, famous film director, stage director, choreographer, conductor.
Well, I keep busy, that's true.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people I haven't worked with, and we've talked about it, and that hasn't happened yet.
But I'm curious, like your really long-time collaboration with Robert Wilson, for example.
But
how did that evolve or develop?
First of all, when I began with the Ensemble, which we talked about, I also at the same time began writing music for plays. I was writing for experimental theater companies, and there was one company called the Mabou Mines, but I worked for other companies also. So I was also writing theater music from the age of 30. Actually, my first theater piece I wrote when I was 20. That was a Scapin by Molière.
Right.
It was done at the McCarter Theater in New Jersey. I still remember I got paid $25 and I had to record it myself. In other words, it cost me money to do it.
Right.
That's how it began. But and I got involved with, because when I was at music school, the first real music school, I was at Peabody, but I was studying composition at Juilliard, and I asked myself a very simple question, which is, who wants the music I'm writing? And my immediate answer was dancers, filmmakers, theater people. And I found out that they actually, if you asked a dancer if they wanted music, they would say, yes, I want some music. I mean, there wasn't none of us had any money anyway, so it wasn't a question of getting paid. It was a question of, and I didn't work with people older with me, I worked with people my age.
Right.
And I began, so by the time I was working with Bob Wilson, that was 15 years later, I had a big background in theater. I knew a lot about collaboration. I knew how to do it. I knew, actually, a big secret of, which is not really a secret, but which it's just that no one talks about, but the main thing about collaboration is trust.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, and I never tell anybody I work with what to do. And normally they don't, if it's a real collaboration, they don't tell me what to do. The pieces that Bob and I did, what we did, I saw on the beach together, we never talked about the piece. We just did the piece.
Well, and they've been some phenomenal evenings. Truly
But
phenomenal. I hope we'll present some of them here eventually.
What's that?
I would love to present some of them here
That
eventually.
would be great. But you know, the thing is that collaboration in the arts it's now become the buzzword of everything. Now we call it devising. We have other words for it, but it's been around for a long time. And in a way, talking about film and opera, with opera, though, I always would say that it's text, movement, image, and music. Those are the four elements. That's the air, earth, fire, and water. That's what it is. Now, the only other art form that has exactly the same number is film. I mean, dance doesn't necessarily have text. Plays doesn't necessarily have music.
Right.
So, but in a funny way, film has become the half brother of the opera world. It's also what we call a popular art form, which, and believe it or not, opera is still a popular art form.
I wouldn't mind having the popularity of film, but yes.
Well, I don't know.
I mean, obviously opera did in the 19th century.
I don't think you want to work with film producers the way they can be a real nuisance, but they are not great. Generally, they're not great collaborators.
No.
You have to find people who do either experimental film or kind of documentary films, but it's very hard to find someone in Hollywood. That's why I having done that with the Marty really was. Marty and Woody were New York composers, were New York filmmakers. They weren't from Hollywood. And I could do a lot with them. I could even suggest things to Marty, to Woody, which he was doing an opera which was one of these triple suicide. You know, he does real dark. When he isn't doing the comic ones, he does the real dark ones. Well, my
films.
Yeah, and I guess it was mine. The popular ones are always the funny ones. The dark ones are never really. I think Brazil was popular, but mine was just before Brazil. I missed it by one movie, and it wasn't. It was one called A Cassandra's Dream, and it was about two brothers who ended up killing each other. Terrible, terrible story. And I said, and I went home to do the first cue for him. And I ordered it. And I said, I think you need an overture. And he said, okay. I came back a couple of days later. He said, what, have you been staying up all night writing? I said, no, I just and I said, and I took as a model a Verdi, like Rigoletto, the overture, a very dark piece of music that you knew that nothing good was going to happen on this.
Right.
Only bad things were going to happen. So I played it for Marty, and he said, oh, that's very, very dark. I said, yes, it's very dark. He said, well, I thought maybe we start light and then get dark. I said, no, I'm going to start dark, and at the end, that'll be the end piece. So we'll have the beginning and the end will be the same piece. And he said, I said, but if you want me to, I'll write you another piece. He said, no, let me think about it. And we didn't talk about it again through the whole process, and then he left to go on tour. We never talked about it at all. And then someone from his studio said, come up, you can see the movie now. And I went up to see it, and he did it just like that. He put the overture at the beginning and at the end.
Sounds like you need to do more of those.
What?
Well, now, Philip, I have to throw this open to the floor a little bit because we need to have some time for some Q&A.
that?
We're going to do a little Q&A now
Okay.
with the public. So if anybody has any questions, I will repeat them. Yes.
I just want to know when you and your ensemble are going to come and play in Washington.
When are you and your ensemble going to come and play in Washington? That's not under the opera's domain, so I can certainly try and push it with the chamber music division, and I wish they were doing it while we were doing Appomattox.
You know, there's one that you could do, and you would even call it an opera because it is an opera.
I could do it. It's just somebody else in the building's got to produce you.
Oh, okay.
All right, that's the
But,
issue.
we have, I took the opera, La Belle et la Bête of Cocteau, and I took the movie and I turned it into an opera. And I kept the screen. What I did is I had, when I was a kid in Paris, I learned how to do doublage, that's the overdubbing, you know. We made a little extra money that way. And I write dubbing scripts, so I knew how to do it. So,
I have to speak to my colleagues to get them to try and do
okay,
it. But
so what happened is I took the film and I timed every syllable in the film. And then I took music paper and I put, it's just like putting clothes on a clothesline. I just put the words in where they would go on the music paper, and then I wrote the music in. And then we played it with the film without the soundtrack. And it looks like the actors are singing.
yeah, it's a wonderful piece.
You've seen it.
Yeah, I have. Well, it was part of a trilogy, which was Orphée, Beauty and the Beast, and Les Enfants Terribles, which was more of a dance piece.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I may have misspoken. I thought that you have a group that plays music still. that
They
you
do.
play piano, and that was,
Well, other people are playing it now. For a long while, that was the only people that, for I would say a good 30 years, no one played it but me. Really a long time.
No, but she's asking about your ensemble. Yes, they do play, and you have some concert dates coming up, right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, our next concert date actually is in Houston at some big, I don't know, some kind of
I will
festival.
do my best to try and convince them, the powers that be. Yes, sir.
Many of us are familiar with your instrumental music going way back to Glassworks and pieces like that from 35 years ago. But we don't know the operas because Washington hasn't done the operas. Do you compose in a different style for opera than you did for the instrumental?
Do you compose in a different style for opera than you do for the
Absolutely.
instrumental pieces?
You bet I do. In the same way, for example, it's very simple. If I'm talking alone with her, we talk in one way. If there are 4 or 5 people in the room, we talk in a different way. If there are 100 people in the room, we talk in a different way. If there are 1,000 people in the room, we talk in another way. I mean, it's absolutely normal. So it depends on what medium I'm working in, how it sounds, it's true. This particular opera that we're doing here, Appomattox, it really breaks all those rules because the story was so big and the characters are so enormously interesting, and it takes so much for the performers to do it. And for us, one thing we did, we have performers in Act 1, also in Act 2.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that, for example, Frederick Douglass, the performer, Solomon Howard, becomes Martin Luther King. So many of the characters have a wonderful doubling. Some of them are great pairings like that. Other are,
Doesn't Tom play LBJ and Lincoln?
yes.
Yeah. So we were able to do that. But I know we've drifted off from the actual question you asked. But when I write music for, It's different. If I write music for films, it's different than if I write a string quartet. I don't have one way of writing music because I have different kinds of audiences.
And we would love to have more of Philip's operas here. You all can help me with that. I'm serious. If we don't do well with Appomattox, November 14, 16, 18, 20, 21, and 22, I can't have him back. Yes, ma'am.
I want to know how you choose the voice, like Grant has a voice, you know, bass I mean, how does that happen?
Ulysses Grant is actually a bass baritone. How do you choose the voices when you decide?
You pick the voices. Actually, I came here, and she said, I want you to hear these singers, and they were really good. And I took them all. I think I took every one of them.
Thank God for that.
Well, it was...
But let's hope that you're happy in the end. Yeah, I mean, I think as a director, having worked with a lot of composers, sometimes it's just great to have that dialogue about it.
Like Tazewell, I had not worked with. You had worked with him before.
Yes.
But he also worked with Joe Nicolaitis, who was at the Public Theater. So we knew I knew him and his work, but we hadn't worked together before this. But he had turned out to be a great collaborator. This particular, I have to say, I don't know what's going to happen to this opera. I don't know where it's going to go, but I can tell you, it's for the people who worked on it, it's been a very enjoyable experience. It's been everything that you want to come out of it it's transfigured the way you thought about things. It changed us. I think everyone who got near it got changed by it in some way.
Yes, sir.
Could you discuss your thoughts on the role of the arts, whether it's the opera Appomattox or the Broadway show Hamilton, of breathing life into history by using the arts?
Well,
did everybody hear that? Can you discuss the role of the arts and how it sort of re-examines history, whether it's Appomattox or the musical Hamilton currently on Broadway, which basically tells the story of the Founding Fathers, and I have to say immediately makes you realize they were revolutionaries because there is total diversity on stage in a way that you forget how revolutionary the Founding Fathers were.
I'll answer the question in maybe an oblique way, but maybe it's a very direct way too. Years ago, before I began really writing a lot of operas, just had maybe done Einstein, my son at the time, who was now in his 40s, he said to me, Daddy, who is, we were on a highway in New York, and it was called the Major Deegan Expressway. He said, who is Major Deegan? I said, I have no idea. And then I realized that, what are we doing? We name our highways about people who we forget about. We name them after politicians. Thurgood Marshall, very important person. We've just named an airport about him. Are you aware of that? Yeah. And I said, that's good for us because we know who he is. Do you think anyone, you ask kids today who de Gaulle is, they have no idea who he is. If you say who is JFK, they don't know. They don't know it was a president. In other words, we do this really dumb thing where we take monuments and public places and we name it after people who are not actually the people who are remembered by a society. When I think of England, I don't think about the politicians. I think about the poets. I think about the painters. When I think about France, I think about also scientists. When I think about any society, I think about the people who give us the. I remember it for the art, and for the music, and for the poetry, and that's not just me. It turns out that one of the biggest part of our GNP is actually what we call the entertainment world, which includes all the stuff that we've been talking about. The funny thing is that I don't know if this is that the arts actually makes more money than baseball does. Did you know that? No, you don't know that. But
let's not bring up the Mets right now.
Well, no. But the point is that for people, even when we don't think we're interested in the arts it's what we live and breathe. It's how we remember ourselves. It's how we know ourselves. It's how we remember our past. when the little we know about Greece is because of the handful of plays that were written, the little bits of pottery. We go into history like someone in France, always in France, they found in a cave the first musical instruments, which was maybe a flute made out of birds' wings, 80,000 years old.
How beautiful.
Now that's breathtaking. If you think about that, someone 80,000 years ago was writing songs. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
I mean, but so when you say, what do I think about it? That's what I think. I think that, now the thing is that we treat artists differently in different countries. We don't treat artists particularly well in this country, nor do we we don't treat them very well in contemporary Italy or contemporary UK. Some countries do very well and support them, some don't. I'm not even sure that the American system is a bad one, because except, you know what they say, what doesn't kill you makes you strong. And that's what you go through to become an artist in America. The only trouble with that is that I believe that we have lost thousands of artists who simply didn't have the stamina to go through what being an artist in this country takes. We have had great artists here, but we would have had many more if there had been some, you know, the National Endowment of the Arts, pardon me, they don't give money to artists anymore. We give money to institutions who then give the money to the artists. But along the way, it's like giving money to the Red Cross. Of course, we only give money to the Red Cross, but how much of that money goes towards, you know, how much money goes to supporting the institutions that we give the money to? I mean, that's just, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But on the other hand, right now, this is an answer to your question. Well, I remember 50 years ago when MacArthur was making a mess of this country. You probably remember that too. Some of you do. And at the time, it was, we lived in a very repressive political climate at the time. People lost their jobs if they didn't create communist relatives that they could betray, and all this kind of stuff was going on all the time. At the same time, there was an explosion in the arts going on. That was when the people who we called the beatniks, but they were people like Allen Ginsberg, and then not long after that was Jackson Pollock. I mean, some of the great artists. And I noticed, even then, as I was very young, I was in my 20s, that in the middle of social chaos, there was great art being made. Then I wait 50 years later, or maybe more, almost 60 years later.
63 years
I'm seeing
later.
the same thing. The country is really messed up. I'm telling you something you don't know. But there are kids doing theater in Brooklyn and writing music and even, I could say, Los Angeles and all kinds of places that you wouldn't think that would be happening. There is a very vibrant, she is presenting a number of young composers who are writing operas now, by the way, that you should find out about that. I know two of them. I know two other composers already. I mean, I know their music.
December 2nd, American Opera Initiative Program.
Yeah,
so
no,
thank you.
This is important. The thing is that we're in the middle of a cultural renaissance right now, and in the middle of the time when the Supreme Court is betraying the very basis of our Constitution and telling us that it is the Constitution. But you know, great thing about America is I can say that, and I don't get arrested, I don't get put in jail. You know,
Right, and I have to say one of our greatest supporters is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I'm extremely grateful to her.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not all.
When I say I'm talking about the rulings. I'm not talking about the individual members.
I
But
know
the
that.
point is,
I hear you. I just want to,
and
I want to
think
keep
some
my
of-
plate clean right now.
And by the
Okay.
way, I've been, you may not know, but the Supreme Court also has a program inviting artists as visitors there. And I was on one year, a few years ago, I was, along with 8 other people, I was a guest of the Supreme Court. And I spent the day with them and looking at them. It was really great. However, that's one thing. And the thing is that we're having real problems about what the basis of what we mean by life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I mean, what is that supposed to mean? We're supposed to be able to do things that makes other people, that makes people angry, and they start legislating about things like that. Anyway, the thing
All those are good reasons to come to the
right.
opera.
But the point I want to say is that right now there's I am sure that there's a cultural renaissance going on among people in their 20s and 30s, and some of them will be here at the Opera House. Some of them will be almost 80. That's me.
So, and with that, I have to say, Philip, we are out of time. I am extremely grateful to you, and I do want to say that we have 6 performances, November 14, 16, 18, 20, 21, and 22 matinee. What he referred to is our American Opera Initiative, which is on December 2nd. We did actually add a performance. It's in the Terrace Theater. I did bring a bunch of calendars, which I asked the ushers to hand out, just to remind people when the performances are, to give to other people. This is a huge moment for us to be doing this revised premiere. Appomattox, Philip Glass, first time ever at the Kennedy Center. Christopher Hampton, Tazewell Thompson, first time at the Kennedy Center. An incredible cast, a cast which represents some of the greatest singers in America right now. I couldn't be more proud of it.
Really cool.
I look forward to welcoming all of you and your 50 friends and nearest and dearest relatives to the performances. Thank you for being here tonight for this, and thank you so much. Thank you, Philip.